Hi, everyone. Welcome to a Friday Light Informal Research Talk. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Geoff Rayner-Canham, who's an honorary research professor and professor emeritus of chemistry at Grenfell campus. It's been my pleasure to know Geoff since I first came to campus in 2014. For those of you who are new, you might not realize Geoff has been here basically from the start of Grenfell's history. I have seen Geoff speak before, and I'm really looking forward to a wonderful talk here. One of the things that he has looked into, along with his collaborator and wife Marlene, is the history of science, really emphasizing women in science. So I've gone to see some of his work on women in chemistry. Today he'll be talking about the amazing career path of Polly Porter, and he'll give his presentation. If you have questions, you're welcome to type them into the chat as we go along, but please hold off speaking or saying anything until the end of the presentation when you'll be able to ask Geoff some questions. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it on to you, except I forgot I should say we're very grateful for the help and support we receive from Marcom and from the research office for getting things set up like this. So thank you so much. All right, here we go. Geoff, whenever you are ready, you're welcome to begin.
Okay, good morning, and thank you, Daniel, for organizing all of this. And first of all, just to mention that this being a joint thing, myself and Marlene, she tends to do the really deep, difficult research, and I get to push it out when it comes to the presentations. So, Polly Porter, that the story begins with Dorothy Hodgkin, Nobel laureate in chemistry, and her work was in X-ray crystallography, and she's popularly described as being the pioneer woman crystallographer. But if you look at her obituary, this was the quote from her obituary. As a fourth-year undergraduate student, she, Hodgkin, was anxious to return to crystallography because she'd worked on it as an undergraduate student. She was greatly encouraged in this by Dr. Polly Porter, a research fellow at Somerville, who had worked for years measuring and cataloging crystals. So Polly Porter preceded Dorothy Hodgkin by a couple of decades, and yet she's been written out of the history. So a little bit about the Porter family. Mary Winnells Porter, she called herself Polly throughout her life, was born in 1886 in Kings Lynn, England. Her father was Robert Percival Porter and mother Alice Porter née Hobbins. Her father's career was still trying to track down more on this because that he was a reporter, he was a journalist, he worked for the US government, he was born in Britain, but he became a naturalized American, and he sold printing equipment to newspapers, and he sort of like flitted from this one to another. She had twin elder brothers, one of whom died young, and two older stepbrothers from her father's first marriage. And as far as we can tell, she never had any contact with the father's previous family, either the stepmother or the stepchildren. And this is very telling. This is a family portrait. And I think that sums up all you need to know about the Porter family. So let's start with the first of the travels that we have that are relevant. From 1901 to 1902, she was in Rome with her mother. Her mother was really sick and being tended by a nun. Her father was a consular official in Cuba and Puerto Rico at the time. And the nun and also the three family friends took 15-year-old Polly Porter around the Roman ruins. And we know a little bit about this because Porter wrote up the diary of her later supervisor, Sir Henry Myers, and added some autobiographical notes. Whoops. So these kind friends took me to see the churches and some of the great archaeological sites. Perhaps the greatest interest these aroused in me was the striking beauty and variety of the coloured marbles to be seen everywhere in Rome, and the temptations displayed for sale in little open windows of stonecutters' shops. So she was really fascinated by these stones, and by amazing coincidence, her family moved to Oxford in England after this. And the Oxford University Museum, shown here, was the depository of the Corsi collection of decorative stones. These being collected by the lawyer Corsi back in 1825. And these were big slabs of different colored marbles, which he catalogued, and they've been sold after his death and purchased by Oxford University. And so she was in Rome looking at the different types of marble and where do our family move to, but Oxford University, where the collection is now located. And this is where Sir Henry Myers comes into our life. He was professor of mineralogy at Oxford University. And this is, again, this is comments from the Department of Geology and Mineralogy. Henry Myers had done what he could to clean the grime of ages, because remember, that was 1825. These had been collected, so you look at 75 years later, off the specimens, and to rescue as many of the labels as possible. But the collection was nonetheless in poor condition when, having observed the young Mary Porter examining the indifferent display in the museum court, he asked her one day whether she was interested in these specimens and whether she would like to work with them. She agreed eagerly and set about the translation of Corsi's Italian catalogue so that specimens which had lost their original labels could be identified and relabeled, and assisted Myers in the rearrangement of the collection. Now, I forgot to mention that her father didn't believe in education for girls, so she was barred from attending any grade school. Her father believed that a girl only needed to learn to read and write, so she had no formal education at this stage. So Myers was probably one of the, or certainly the British expert on the scientific study of minerals. And as Porter then writes, Professor Myers had the patience and kindness to introduce me little by little to minerals and their crystals. Crystallography, the queen of all sciences, came first in his love of science. The striking outward shapes of crystals with the complexity of their internal structure led me to desire to know more of their elementary attributes. The height of my ambition in those days was to do crystal calculations. These again were autobiographical notes. And in addition to the Oxford collection, that Porter contacted the importer of marble into Britain for building construction, and she actually obtained additional samples that the Oxford University holdings were missing. Now, by the age of 21, she wrote a book, and this book is an absolute classic. And I have a facsimile copy if any of you have got my image coming up. And this is astounding because the writing is amazing, the literacy and the footnoting, everything from classical works like Horace, Suetonius, right through to various archaeologists who put in reports and filed them with Oxford University in the Bodleian Library. This, if you picked this up and you didn't know who Mary Reynolds Porter was, you would think that he was an elderly professor who'd spent their entire life working on this subject. The reviews appeared in all the academic British journals. One of these was The Antiquary, a magazine devoted to the study of the past. And this is what they wrote. Miss Porter has hit upon an almost untrodden byway in classical history and topography. In this scholarly and well-written volume, the product evidently of a wide and deep and well-ordered knowledge, discusses the marbles, the variety of stone and marble, which were used in the construction of imperial Rome. Miss Porter's monograph is an excellent piece of work. And as I say, her book was reviewed in many, many archaeological journals, and all of them had no idea that she was 15 years old when she started this and 21 years of age when it was published. She and her mother then went to the United States. How do we know this? And this is one of Marlene's specialities. The manifests of the ships crossing the Atlantic, and In November 1907 on the SS Carmania. She and her mother traveled from Liverpool to New York, and there's the entry: Porter Alice R., wife, Porter Mary W., 21 years old, daughter. So we pinned that down. It's amazing the stuff that's available if only you know how to search for it, which Marilyn does. The Boston Globe did an interview of her. So this is in 1908 now, and there's a portrait of her, and just a brief extract from a very lengthy article about her, which was reprinted in the other newspapers in the United States. The critical papers of England have bestowed praise on the work as one of unusual accuracy, and Miss Porter has received, as a result of the book and her labours at Oxford, offers from other museums abroad to classify and catalogue their collections of minerals and marbles. Then comes the addition: these offers she has declined as her parents think her too young to take up such work at present. Then it's back across the Atlantic. I tell you, the Porters flitted across the Atlantic like you and I might pop over to Deer Lake, or maybe pop down to Stephenville. They were just zipping backwards and forwards across the Atlantic. So they spent the winter of 1910, 1911 in London. And this is where she met Professor Tutton. Sir Henry Myers had organized a dinner party, invited Polly Porter to it, and she sat next to Professor Tutton. And Professor Tutton asked whether she would like to help him in the laboratory, do the cleaning, washing the glassware and things. Well, that's how it started, but before long, she was actually synthesizing compounds and then doing crystal studies on them. And this is her first publication, and though it appeared in 1912, it was 1911 work in the Mineralogical Magazine. And this was work on crystals where they had one anion but two different cations fitting in different spaces in the crystal lattice. And if you go on Google and you type in Tutton salts, this is what you'll find: is these double cation substances, which most of them are prepared, analyzed, and then the crystal structures reported by his student Mary Porter. So here she is. She's had her first publication, still no qualifications, still nothing except being taught how to read and write formally. Then it's back across the Atlantic again, and this time to Washington, D.C., and to Smithsonian Institute. And the head at the time was George Merrill. Now, she met him before on one of the previous trips to the United States, because in her book, in the introduction, she actually mentions and thanks him for discussions on the classification of marbles. So way back in 1906 she had met him on a previous trip to the United States. Now, one of the things George Merrill had to do, and remember the Smithsonian Institute was really new, was to catalogue the stones for the museum. This was not just to catalogue them, but at the time that the federal government was going through a building spree, and all the buildings had to be built of certain types of stone. Now, if you're building a federal building in Seattle and you liked a particular marble, you couldn't use it if it came from a quarry in Vermont. So she had to catalogue the different types of marbles, granites, basalts, and identify which quarries they came from. So if it's, say, as I mentioned, Seattle, then she would make sure that it was stones that were available on West Coast, maybe from Oregon or Washington State or somewhere around there, maybe Idaho. So this is quite important work. The family were on the move again. The father got a position in Munich as a journalist. So away they went across to Munich. And it was at Munich that she met Professor Heinrich von Groth, professor of mineralogy, University of Munich museum curator. And so for the first part of 1913, she worked in the Bavarian State Collection of Paleontology and Geology, identifying the minerals and measuring the crystal properties and recording them. Well, of course, putting early 1930 means that the family is on the move again. This time it was to Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. And this is a picture of the library and the museum that's attached to it. Now, Bryn Mawr had the top woman geologist of the time, Florence Bascom. She was renowned as being an incredibly brilliant geologist. And here she is again later in life supervising some of the field work. And Bryn Mawr College had a mineral collection donated by Theodore Rand, or paid for. And this is off of one of the specimens. Now, she went as a student, but she was poverty-stricken, and the only way she could afford the fees was by Bascom arranging for her to catalogue the collection at Bryn Mawr. We'll never know, but have a suspicion that this was one of the labels that she typed up because she spelt sulfide with a PH, whereas in the US they commonly spelt it with an F. So maybe not, but there's always that thought it might be. And she and Bascom became very good friends throughout the life, and this was so fortunate because she wrote to Bascom throughout Bascom's life. And the letters were deposited at Smith College. And we tracked them, I shouldn't say we, Marilyn tracked them down. And she contacted Kate Long, the archivist, and she arranged for the scanning of all the letters that Porter wrote to Bascom, which amounted to 297 pages of correspondence. And she sent them to us, and so these will be a predominant source from now on of Porter's own thoughts, comments, and progress. Well, you can imagine that she moved on. Porter had done a sabbatical in Heidelberg with Victor Mordecai Goldschmidt. There's two Victor Goldschmidts. There's the Norwegian geologist and the German geologist, and this is the lesser known Victor Mordecai Goldschmidt. And so Florence Bascom pleaded with Goldschmidt to have Porter over to work with him. And this he was willing to do. So he invited her over, and there's the Heidelberg University, and he had invented a goniometer, the Goldschmidt two-circle contact goniometer, for precisely measuring the angles of crystals. And it's a truism that the precise angles, the precise shape of the crystals are characteristic of a particular elemental composition. So you could actually determine the element composition if you knew the angles and you had a directory of all the possible compounds it could be. So she worked with him in Heidelberg. Now, if you notice the dates, 1914 to 1915. So the First World War had broken out during this period. Goldschmidt was severely affected by the war, and he finished up in he had a nervous breakdown and went off to a sanatorium, and she had very little contact, and for most of this time she was working in the laboratory all alone. It was very difficult because it appears that she was traveling on a British passport, and so the German professors and other students of course didn't like her because she was the enemy, and also that she was female, so she was barred from some of the professors' lectures she wished to attend, because on those two grounds she was British, she was female, and they wouldn't let her in to hear them. Things got pretty bad for her, and so she applied for an American passport. And this, I should mention before I leave this one, she wrote to Bascom, "My one ambition in Heidelberg were to become a less unworthy student of yours." She had very low self-esteem, which is not uncommon among women scientists, or women in general. And so this was typical of some of the exchanges or the letters that she sent to Bascom about how she was not worthy of being Bascom's student. So here's a picture of her from her passport application. And you notice it says on it, emergency. So she was desperate to get an American passport so she could travel out of Germany and back across to wherever she was going. And she went to Italy. And this was interesting because remember the war was on, and she never mentioned in Bascom how she got from Germany to Italy, but we think it has to have been via Switzerland. And for those of you not onto European history, Italy was on the Allied side in the First World War. It was Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire against Britain, France, Belgium, and Italy. So somehow she got to Italy. And one of the reasons she went to Italy was to go to the Carrara marble quarries. This is the most famous marble in the world. If you Google it, you'll find it still noted as being the best marble quarries. So this was a postcard she sent Bascom on the right-hand side. So from the commentary she put, yesterday I visited the quarries. It took 7.5 hours walking all the time, but it was most interesting. Then further on in the postcard, she mentions, the police sent for me at Massa, where she was staying this morning, to find out why I was here. But it was settled satisfactory. And then she adds, both places, Massa and Carrara, are in the war zone. But she wanted to see the Carrara marble quarries, so a war wasn't going to stop her from doing that. Now, Bascom was expecting her back at Bryn Mawr, but she didn't. She then went back to Oxford, her beloved place. And Myers had long left and had been replaced by Thomas Vipont Barker. And Barker was really dedicated on this idea that if you catalogued all the different crystal angles, different crystal types, you could actually identify the chemical composition. And he eagerly took Porter on as his research student. Now, this is the time when the Dyson-Pounds chemistry laboratory at Oxford University just opened. And being in the war, nearly all of the researchers had gone off at some form or other to actually fight in the war. So she initially was the only research student there. As she commented, there's no one in the laboratory here but myself. Mr. Barker is working on dyes in the chemical department. He comes in once or twice a day, however, to see me. She also worked synthesizing organic compounds for William Henry Perkins Jr., but we were unable to find anything about that, just simply that she was noted as having worked with him. The thing to realize was Porter suffered from ill health, and this was pretty much throughout most of her life. And she was urged to contact Dr. Jane Walker, who was the premium woman doctor in Britain, very, very famous woman doctor in Britain. And she decided that Porter needed an operation desperately. So she put Porter in contact with Dr. Mary Charlieb, and Charlieb was the top woman gynecologist and surgeon in Britain at the time. So she went for an operation. Mrs. Charlieb was operating in me 2 hours. Now remember, this is the era of ether and chloroform, nothing else. And 2 other troubles were found, one of which was a poisonous appendix, which she says has caused more trouble than anything else. This was 1916. Oh, I should mention about for the recovery, and of course there's no painkillers, and Porter said that the 48 hours afterwards were sheer horror. But the recommended diet at that time was beef jelly and champagne at 4-hour intervals. She continued having ill health, and in 1931, we don't know who the doctor was because Charlieb had died by then, I had to have a bad operation. I've lost a good deal of my anatomy and a good deal that ought not to have been there. So keep in mind that she was not a healthy person. She had these internal problems. She got professional acceptance in 1918. And the thing that Marley and I have shown for many of the British organizations, they did not accept women at all well. In fact, for the Chemical Society, it took 40 years from the first application before women were gradually accepted because of the government outlawing of the discrimination on the basis of gender. So for her, the key organization was the Mineralogical Society. And she wrote to Bascom, "Did I write you that I'd been nominated for election to council of the Mineralogical Society? There was a great row about having a woman in capital letters on it, but the majority agreed in the end. I've accepted, so expect to be elected at the next meeting." And she was indeed. Marley and I looked at the minutes of the Mineralogical Society, and she had actually been added. But what's interesting in the minutes was there was no mention about this great row that she refers to. So obviously this was something that they didn't want to appear in the minutes of the society. But this was professional acceptance, not just to be a member, but to be elected to council of it. So she was regarded very highly within the society. She was granted a fellowship in 1919. There are only 2 fellowships in Oxford, and I've been elected to one, the better of the 2. It's the Lady Carlisle Research Fellowship for 5 years at Somerville College. This brings with it £120 per year. This is the best fellowship in the country for women. And this is the thing I'll return to a little later on, is the fact that she didn't have any steady income. She relied on small amounts of money from her father, from a friend, and this was her main income, were these grants that she got. A little bit of mention about Lady Carlisle. There were so many amazing women characters at the time. The Countess of Carlisle, she was called the Red Countess because her views were somewhere between socialism and communism. And she was absolutely a avowed feminist. And so it was quite natural that she would sponsor a research fellowship. The other thing in this letter was interesting was she remarked, "The friend who was with me in the flat has joined me here, which makes it very pleasant because they provided housing." And she talked about other people in her life, but she was very coy about the friend. We know she was female. We know they were very close friends because at one point they temporarily adopted an Austrian young girl who was a refugee, and but there was no mention as to who this friend was, which was very odd. And she'd completed the requirements for a degree by research. You didn't have to take any courses. You could get a degree by research. She had extensive publications, which I've glossed over for this talk. And in 1920, that the Oxford converted these temporary women's certificates of graduation into an actual degree. On October the 14th, I got my BSc degree with the first 50 women to receive degrees at the university. I was the only BSc. It was an ordeal as a Sheldonian. It was packed with people, about 2,000 to 3,000, and had a little ceremony all to myself. So she now had a degree to add. And she was at Somerville College with her fellowship, and this is where she started producing significant amount of research on her own. So this is in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of London, very prestigious. There's her first solo research paper, Mary W. Porter, Lady Carlisle Research Fellow, BSc Oxon, Somerville College, communicated by Sir Henry Myers, who gave the presentation because you could only present the work if you were a fellow of the Royal Society, which obviously she was not. So her career was well underway at this point. Now, for a fair bit of it, she was residing in this flat she'd alluded to earlier on Museum Road. But then later on, in 1923, she refers to, "I've just bought a tiny house," but her finances were always very, very fragile. And in 1930s, she wrote again to Bascom, "I had to give up and sell my tiny house. the DSIR, that's the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, has renewed my grant of £200 per annum for 3 more years. So this has been a great help. So she's always teetering on the edge of poverty. Well, actually, I think her entire life she was poverty-stricken. In 1932, she was granted the highest honor because of all her research papers on crystals and crystal structures. The third degree is the DSc, and for this there is no examination. 2 judges are appointed to examine the work and report to the board of your special faculty. I took the degree last Thursday and have a lovely scarlet and grey gown, and there's the gown as a DSc that she was entitled to wear. The culmination of work was the cataloguing of all these crystal types and correlating with chemical composition. And this was called the Barker Index of Crystals after Barker, but Barker by then had died. So she became the senior author and took on R.C. Spiller, reader in mineralogy, as her co-author. So these are the 2 parts of volume 1. So these are massive works, thousands of crystal structures listed therein. And so it's very clearly under her name as the primary author. And this is the volume 2, also under her name with also Spiller. At this point, Spiller died. So she's had 1 more volume to do of the most obscure type of crystal structures. And she took on another co-author, and she also taught herself computer skills because by the 1950s, computing was coming in as a means of cataloging. And this was how she was able to do volume 3 together with a new co-author, which was L.W. Codd. Now, I couldn't find an image of the original printing, so this is a recent print off of the original. And Codd was not a very nice person because in 1965 he wrote an article called The Barker Index of Crystals as an Analytical Tool, how you could determine the chemical composition by crystal structure, and he does not anywhere in it mention the name of Mary Porter or Polly Porter. So mentions Barker's name, a little difficult not to mention Barker's name, not a single mention that Porter was the actual person who compiled all this work. Porter's last research publication came in 1950. Dorothy Hodgkin at this time had deduced the structure of vitamin B12, but she wanted to report the precise crystal dimensions, the types of crystals. So who should she get but the 2 people who knew the most and had the most prestige in terms of their reporting on the crystals. And so this particular article in the Proceedings of the Royal Society in 1950 was co-authored by Porter and, at that time, Spiller. In her later life, because now don't forget she's getting into the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, she returned to her first love of the Courcy marbles because now 50 years has elapsed since she previously looked at them, and chemistry had come a long way. There's no more about the nature of the impurities in the calcium carbonate which cause the different colors. So Porter came back, and according to History of the Courcy collection, that she gave instructions for the labeling of decorative stones in some of the older petrological collections in the museum. She reviewed the display of the Courcy collection, and she illustrated displays with photographs of the stones used in monuments and statuary, and with samples of the Egyptian alabastry and cosmati pavement. So she was working right up until the end of her life. And her life ended 1980 in Oxford at age 94. So what happened to Barker Index of Crystals? A lot of university libraries still have it on their shelves, all the volumes of it. But perhaps the epitaph is best written by the geology department of Oxford University. The preparation of the Barker Index constituted a major part of the research work of the Department of Mineralogy for many years, or in other words, Porter's work. Remarkable document though it undoubtedly is, the fact cannot be disguised its practical value has been very limited due to the rapid development since the late 1920s of X-ray diffraction methods in crystallographic analysis. Although in order to do crystallographic analysis, you really needed to know the category of crystal. And so it was a little bit unfair in that respect. And also, she was using it for chemical analysis, not for determining the iron and atom positions. The index is very much part of the Oxford Department's history. However, with meticulously detailed work devoted to a cause which, to many, must have seemed lost almost from the outset. So it was just a side backwater of science. She devoted her entire life to it. She devoted enthusiasm. She wrote the classical papers on it. She wrote a book at the age of 21, even though she'd never had any formal education. Even when Myers pleaded with her parents to let her have a university education, the parents refused. So here's someone who had an amazing life, who traveled, who was in these different institutions, making major contributions to understanding types of crystals. And so with that, I will end. And there is Mary Polly Porter, 1886 to 1980, an amazing career covering, zipping back from country to country and being in the right place at the right time to appreciate the Caucasus collection, Marilyn Washington, Myers, Goldschmidt, and Florence Bascom. So thank you so much.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Geoff. So people are welcome to either speak questions, you can type them in. For people who are watching through Facebook, if you type them in, I can relay them to Geoff. So you're welcome to do that too. So we'll open up the floor and let's see. So we have Svetlana. Are you still seeing the text in the chat here, Geoff?
Yes, I am. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks,
great.
Svetlana. Much appreciated. I must admit, I enjoy doing this. It just assembly. It's like jigsaw puzzles and forensic science or something all rolled into one. Just searching down the right quote and the right image that I can find and putting it together in a presentation. It's fun, although stressful fun, because I was modifying it right up to 2 minutes before we went on the
air. On that note, or the note of it. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Erica. It's so good. Thank you for linking in from St. John's campus.
So I was going to ask how you and Marlene ended up getting into this this kind of work, because I imagine this is quite different than doing chemistry or being a chemist. The types of skills and knowledge you mentioned it being sort of like a crossword puzzle.
Yeah.
How did you start exploring these kinds of women in science history?
Well, that's a very good question, Daniel, because it's not something people generally fall into. There's a book called The Discovery of the Chemical Elements, which was written in 1930s, and I can't remember why I opened it. I had a copy, and it's all these pictures, these old white guys usually with beards, and about to pop the mortal plane or whatever it is. And there was this picture of this young woman, and underneath it said Harriet Brooks. And I said to Marlene, this is Harriet Brooks, never heard of her. Maybe this can be a summer project, just a couple of weeks thing. Well, it turned out Harriet Brooks had worked with Ernest Rutherford and really the discoverer of radon, if you wanted to put it very briefly. And no one had written anything about her. So we did research, and it took us to archives in Britain, in Russia, in France, in the United States, and we wrote it up and submitted it for a grant for publication from the Canada Council, and we got a comment back saying, this is absolutely amazing stuff, except it's written by scientists who are clueless about how to write the sort of historical work. This is absolutely dreadful. But it's so important. I'm willing, this person said, to actually take them under my wing and teach them how to write social science history.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they did. And after writing the book on Harriet Brooks, we kept on coming across the names of other women in radioactivity. So the next book was about them. And then we got contacted by the American Chemical Society saying, that was a great book. No one's ever written on history of women in history of chemistry. Why don't you write one? And it's just gone on and on from there. Every time we say, well, that's it now. And then up comes someone like Mary Polly Porter. And we find out there's a Wikipedia entry, which is usually science ones aren't bad. But this one is dreadful in terms of being misleading, wrong, had different places, and that's got to go. And the letters from Smith College, you know, the letters to Bascom, just incredible. You know, and I should mention that each one of them, she's so dedicated. She said, well, she got all these health problems. Oh, by the way, she come across this crystal with amazing different faces and an angle of 28.7 degrees. You know, it's like, no, she couldn't give up the work even though when she was so sick and everything. So it's a fascinating area, but it goes on and on because there's so many amazing women back in the Victorian era that have been forgotten and overlooked and did amazing things. Well, like her, you know, flitting here, there, and everywhere, and doing all this stuff.
Yeah, wonderful. All right, I have lots of follow-up questions to that, but I'll pause and we'll make sure that other people get the opportunity to ask. So maybe so people feel free to type in your messages or to speak if you would like. Um, you were talking about these forgotten women chemists and women in science. So it sounds what you were describing here that her father really was quite sexist in believing that women shouldn't even go to get any kind of formal education. Rather, in addition to, so they should be able to read and write, I guess. But anything beyond that was superfluous. Um,
Exactly.
and how? So, from what I remember about some of your other work, that there was this education in chemistry that was happening in some of these schools and places where women were able to go. So, was this a particularly um, sexist father that she had, or was that attitude actually quite prevalent? I guess I'm no longer certain what was it like in society. Was she really like, was that a very unusual opinion or somewhat common in the day?
I think, and I'm no social scientist on this, but I think it was very common in that day. Well, remember the Queen of England, the Queen Elizabeth, she never got a formal education. It was believed then that the Queen, you know, her education was strictly by a governess, that she
Right.
didn't learn anything else. So I think it's very, very common. I think it's more the exceptions probably where the fathers believed that the daughters should become well educated, but it was this is a dysfunctional family times two because the father divorced the first
Mhm.
wife
Right.
in the States and left her with the two children, then marries another one, and then seems to spend the rest of his life wandering hither and yon and abandons the with you know the brother doesn't seem to be much in the picture except later on when he would send Polly some money to enable her to survive, but he flits off here, there, and everywhere as a journalist, and this American consul to the Puerto Rico and Cuba. This was through his connections in Washington D.C. apparently, but he was a very distant figure. It was her and her mother pretty much.
Yeah. This is not a question, but it is a comment from Stephen Decker, so I'll relay this to you just to make sure that you get to see it. or hear it rather. Stephen Decker says, thanks for bringing us this story, Geoff and Marlene. There are many amazing women that have contributed significantly to establishing various fields, and I salute you both for exploring such stories and bringing them to us.
Well,
All right.
thank you. And I've got one. Who's this from? Wait a minute. Whoops. Oh, yes. I love how you conveyed her enthusiasm for the subject. While she was with Goldschmidt, was she essentially keeping the work going while he was ill, or was she working on other things? Did he return to the lab after? Yes, she was. She kept going on in the lab while he was ill. His wife came in and saw her from time to time and relayed thoughts on what she should be working on. He returned to the lab after, but he was really a broken man, and he didn't do that much. And then the Goldschmidt family was Jewish, and then the Nazis came to power. He died. His wife stayed alive, and Porter, together with her friend, whoever the friend is, tried to get her out of Germany before it was too late. They managed to get nieces out and other people, but the widow Goldschmidt refused to go, saying she was a loyal, patriotic German. And in the end, that her doctor gave her pills to swallow and kill herself before she was sent off to a concentration camp. But Goldschmidt was a broken man at the end of the First World War and really didn't go beyond that in terms of a significant amount of work.
Wonderful. All right. Let me just pop her picture. Okay.
Geoff, this is Erica again. I wonder, it was just so tragic to see that last comment from the department history page about how she was really just working on stuff that didn't matter anymore and was beyond its time, because clearly she was still publishing it, right? So
Yes, yeah.
I wonder how much of that attitude is because she's a woman, or just a weird understanding of what science is. Because I mean, we constantly go back to these classic texts, even though we have, computers to tell us everything today. We still go back to these seminal explorations, qualitative explorations of what chemistry is.
I think it's a good point, but I'm not sure we'll ever be able to get to the root of it. I think they were right in a way in that that all these Barker's indexes, remember, the whole idea was, that if you got a crystal, measured the angles very precisely, or categorized the crystal as to whether it's triclinic and monoclinic and so on, and then you measured the precise angles, you could actually look it up in the Barker index and determine the chemical composition. And they were right in the respect that very few people did that. Now, she actually did back in the 1930s and 40s. She was very triumphant that one of the medical people at Oxford found crystals in the lungs of a deceased patient and wanted to know what the crystals were. And Porter used her method of measuring the crystal angles, actually identified the mineral that was embedded in the patient's lung by this method, and she actually published the article. It was a mineral called struvite that she identified by that. But it was very painstaking. Porter's very dismissive as well, that very few people took the time to learn how to use the Goldschmidt goniometer and be able to measure precisely. And I think that was part of it. So I think they were right to a certain extent. I think you're very right as well in terms of it's an immense body of work. She devoted her life to it, and the letters to Bascom, it was clear she worked 7 days a week, rarely took vacations, doing all this measurement, synthesizing new compounds, recording their angles, cataloging them, and putting them in what was to become the volume. So incredible amount of dedicated work, but people simply prefer to go to the lab and do wet chemistry and analyze rather than using a Goldschmidt goniometer. Does that sort of answer your question, Erica?
Oh, yes, thank you very much. Yeah.
All right. Other questions? So I just want to thank you again, Geoff, for taking the time to share this work and introducing us to yet another woman of science that we really should know about. So I'm very grateful that this work is being done and that you're sharing it with us.
Well, thank you.
Is there anything else that you want to share for our viewers or listeners, or a hint? Are you continuing? Is there another project that's coming up for you?
Oh, well, well, you walked into that one, didn't you, Daniel? There was a London School of Medicine for Women, which interestingly, both Jane Walker and Mary Charlieb actually attended. And it's a deceased institution. In 1947. They announced we don't need a medical school for women because everyone's equal now. That there are no barriers for women's progress, haha. And this institution has been forgotten about, but the particular interest was that they had a chemistry department because, like all medical schools, you had to learn chemistry. And this chemistry department had some amazing women, and we researched a little about them, and we found out so much more. And now we're under contract to produce a monograph on them by the end of next year. So we're already under the gun for another book. But this again is another story of amazing women. Just a quick anecdote. One of them was Edith Pesci. She'd gone to Edinburgh to study there. The professor of chemistry said he'd only teach the women separately. But it was quite equivalent. There were no differences. So she came out top of the class for both of them. But he said, I can't award you the gold medal because you're a woman and you were taught separately. It'll go to the third class guy in the men's class. And this caused an international outcry, which actually made it to states and things like that. And so absolutely, the more you dig, the more you find, and the more you realize how much is out there. So yes, look forward to early 2022 to our monograph on the women chemists of the London School of Medicine for Women.
Wonderful. All right, we will stay tuned for that. Thank you so much.
Okay, and hope to see you in reality one of these months.
Yes, I look forward to that too.
Okay, bye everyone.
All right,
and thanks for tuning in.
That's right. Tune in next week. All right.
Bye.
Goodbye.